For me, I would say it's a leader who has challenged those invisible rules and is really striving to do what makes sense for the people in the business, regardless of how it's always been done or what they think the guardrails are. And that takes a lot of creativity and confidence in yourself and your team to say, maybe that's not the best way we could do it. Do we really have to do it that way? And then maybe trying something different and having the psychological safety within themselves and their team to try something different and be okay if it doesn't work out.
Welcome to the Unleashing Leaders podcast, where we work with willing leaders to accelerate the changes you seek. We'll learn from the experiences of different leaders facing real challenges and distill practical, purposeful steps to apply in your context. I'm Lee Scott, your curious co-pilot. Together, let's make positive changes for our companies and communities. Today, we're joined by our guest, Andrea Herron. She is the head of people in Portland, Oregon for WebMD, and she is also the co-author of a book, The Elephants in Your Office. Today, we're going to be looking at how leaders can better identify and some practical techniques for handling interactions with colleagues and leading up when folks are having various flavors of mental health challenges. This is an area that's had a lot of stigma, had a lot of challenges, and yet it's a rising challenge in all workforces. So how do we enter into those conversations effectively? Andrea, looking forward to get your guidance for our leaders today. Tell us a little bit about what your current role is and what you're doing, and then let's dive back into your history and what inspired you to write this great book.
Thank you for having me. I am thrilled to be here. I do a little bit of everything, heading up people at WebMD, and then also through my book and work with mental health and training managers and helping organizations with education, coaching. We can get everybody in a better place as it relates to culture and well-being.
Yeah, and that well-being has been such a huge theme, and it encompasses many facets, as you and I talked about leading up to this conversation. Tell us a little bit about one dimension that you became more present with somebody that was very near and dear to your heart, and you had no idea was happening.
Yeah. So the backstory for most books is personal. We rewind in time and go back to about 2018. I got a call from my sister, and she was freaking out because she was going to get fired from her job. And so naturally, she called her sister in HR, which is me. She starts going on this whole tangent about how her medication has to change and her anxiety and depression is getting worse, and she's working with her therapist on this plan and so on. And I was like, what are you talking about? What anxiety? What depression? I had absolutely no idea. And so I wanted to help her get through that. I started looking for what resources are out there. Is there anything I could point her towards or help her give her manager or anything? It was really very legal talk or just benefit guidelines. It was really unhelpful.
While that's all important, it does create a barrier to being able to serve and support. And this is your sister. She's your rock star. You guys grew up together. So if I can't see that, how in the heck can I see it with maybe somebody that I didn't grow up with?
That's exactly right. And all of those documents, while accurate, are pretty unhelpful to your average manager who's just trying to support their staff and do the best they can. So that really was a flag to me that if I didn't know what was going on with her, I certainly didn't know what was going on in my employee group, nor did I have the tools or resources to help anybody with it. And this was pre-pandemic. So mental health was pretty taboo. It had a lot of stigma. People were not talking about it. Once I was able to help her get through that scenario, which she was able to get some accommodations and keep her job, we decided to write this book together. And so we wrote it from her perspective as someone with a mental health disorder at work and what that experience is like. And then from my perspective, from the HR and business side, what managers and leaders can actually do to better support mental health in the workplace.
Wonderful. And mental health being such a huge subset, when we talk about wellness, people talk about fitness and nutrition and the medical side and the dental and all those things. And they're all important. They're all part of the equation. Also, your financial well-being, all of those things go into it. But you're really calling out this component of the mental and behavioral health of a person. And I think to your point, pre-pandemic, it was like, well, that was the exception. That was for a small subset of folks that were really out there, but that's not me. And I think the reality is that all of us are just one string of couple of bad days in a row. potentially away from experiencing that ourselves. So it is more visible, it is more broad now and understood. And I don't think that's because it's more prevalent than it was before. I think you just were able to recognize it a little bit more. But then now we're recognizing, we're like, what the heck do I do with it?
Exactly. The National Alliance on Mental Illness, it tells us that 1 in 5 US adults suffers from a mental health disorder every year.
And that's per year. So over 5 years,
Right. And those were pre-pandemic numbers. And we know that that pandemic itself caused some increases in that. But mental health isn't something we can win. We all have it. We all have to take care of it. So we published a book in 2019 and got some traction. But then 2020 hit. Then we all experienced the world of isolation and being remote and hybrid. And what that does to your mental health is a totally different way for managers to support their staff. So we actually published a second edition in 2022 to kind of bridge that gap of the remote workforce and the things we had learned.
wonderful, very timely. Are you ready for a greatest hits yet? You've already cut 2 albums and you've got another book as well too. So this is great.
I never thought I would write anything, but it just wrote itself. It's pretty basic because if we really think of those 1 in 5 US adults, most of those people have a job. Most of those people are employed. And so they do fall into different categories. We use an elephant metaphor just to keep it light and cheeky because it can be a hard topic. There is still some stigma, of course. So it is broken down into 3 groups that hopefully managers can identify people within their groups and where they might fall in that or what they might have experienced.
Tell us a little bit about identifying these 3 species of elephants. What are the different subspecies of elephants that you're seeing roaming around your typical office?
One thing I feel very strongly about just in my day job, even in HR, is making things relatable. Storytelling is absolutely an underutilized skill for HR practitioners and managers in particular. And so you have to be able to relate to people, or it's just going to go right over their head, especially if there's stigma. So, the first herd we have here is the amazing mammoths. These people are going to be in something we call an adjustment disorder. An adjustment disorder is a real thing. And it's basically when someone is going through a regular life event, could be a divorce, could be sickness of a loved one, a life change, a job change, birth of a child. These are just regular things that most people experience. And most of us can kind of ride those waves up and down throughout the course of our life. But if our coping mechanisms are not working for us, if they're outdated, they're not keeping up, or we just get too overwhelmed, you move to something called an adjustment disorder because you just can't ebb and flow. And it becomes very similar to a depression or anxiety. It could show up like that, but it is temporary, right? It is tied to that event. And so managers can look for things like changes to the regular flow. But if someone who usually comes in and is very chipper and says good morning, no longer said anything, goes straight to their desk, people who usually come in very put together, now looking a little disheveled, maybe there's some question on hygiene, or even someone on camera, if you're in a hybrid situation who's always on camera and all of a sudden they're not, all of these are just signs that something is not as it usually is. Now, people are allowed to have privacy. They don't have to share what's going on with you, of course, but that is a flag for managers to check in and say, how are things going? I just noticed this and this is a little different. Is everything okay?
Like you said, like maybe the follow through starts to drop off a little bit, or the attention to detail is not quite there, or the level of engagement has a disruption. You described it as being a temporary thing that's triggered by life changes. And I think it's also important to realize that it could be a good or a bad change. Like your kids are going off to college, you're really excited about that. Or, hey, you're moving to your dream home. Or, hey, your spouse is retiring and you're not yet, but you're excited for them. These can be good things, but they tax us and it can create that overwhelm, is what I'm hearing you describe. And then you're just like, okay, my normal elasticity and capacity to handle and ebb and flow is already being consumed by other things. So I just have less to be able to navigate. And then I can't adjust. That's what I'm hearing there. Is that still saying with the woolly mammoths?
That's exactly right.
All right, well, help me out because I'm not a therapist. What might be an example of a way to reach out?
That's a great question. And I think that question is one of the reasons that keeps managers from asking because they don't know what to say. They don't want to get in trouble. They don't want to cross a boundary. And those are great instincts. That's okay. We want them to have that level of discernment. So, the best tip I can give you in any of these scenarios when you want to ask someone because you've noticed something is off, You just simply say, hey, I've noticed this is off, whatever this is. And that needs to be tied to an observable work behavior, not a rumor, something you have observed tied to the work. Say, hey, I've noticed that you're not responding to my emails as you usually do. And that feels off to me because you're normally really good at that. Is something going on? Versus, I heard you've been staying up late all night. Why aren't you responding to my emails? Observable work behavior.
I know exactly what you're talking about. We make that distinction all the time when we're developing and coaching leaders and training, and yet they find it so hard. And one of the ways we've tried to separate is if it's something that you could record on camera or with a microphone, it's either something they said, something they didn't say, something they didn't do. Those are behaviors. But if you say, hey, you've been messy, that's not a behavior, that's a characterization. Or, hey, you really seem moody, that's an emotion you're describing, that's not a behavior. So I think it's safer when you're talking about behaviors. Hey, I noticed the follow through hasn't been consistent as it's used to. Hey, I've noticed you've not been on camera. Hey, I've noticed the frequency of your contributions to a conversation have really tapered off suddenly over the last 2 months. And the nice thing about behaviors is there's no judgment. It's like, hey, you don't seem engaged. Hey, you seem lazy. Hey, seem you're not pulling your weight. If you start with an attack, that door is closing. But if you start with a compassionate description, then it's like, oh, you see me.
Right, because you're not immediately wanting to put up their defenses. You're genuinely concerned because you care. And so it's very important that you approach it the way you're describing, which is, hey, I've noticed this. And it's a little out of character for you or what I'm used to. Is everything okay? Is there a roadblock? Is there something going on I should know about? And if they say no, which they can do because it's their personal business, then you say, okay, well, the door's open. If something changes, let me know. And then as long as the performance doesn't continue to deteriorate or become an actual problem that you need to address with HR and a coaching plan or something, they're allowed to have ups and downs as long as they're still doing what they need to do at the baseline respect level. Give them a little space if they want it.
Yep. That's the room for grace. But that was a huge if. Maybe they're a high performer. Now they're trending in that more middle of the pack for a period of time. And you know what? You're going through a lot of stuff right now. Maybe you're getting married, maybe you're getting divorced. And so you can just say, hey, I respect that. But you can still ask for it and says, I'd like to know what I could do to support you to make sure that you're performing at the level we're used to seeing. So if you keep it focused on behavior and performance, I'm seeing a green light. If it's got judgment and shames and blames, I'm seeing a red light.
Exactly. And how much they're willing to share with you is completely dependent on their comfort and the trust that you have built in that relationship over time. You can't jump into a new management relationship and expect people to be open and vulnerable with you unless you've shown them that is okay. Because some of these things are still very personal. And so it's important to remember to not take it personally if someone doesn't want to share.
Let me ask you two follow-up questions here, Andre, because I didn't realize I was going to be a therapist when I signed up to be a supervisor, but we all know that's part of the gig. So two permutations of this. One is what happens if you get yourself an oversharer? They're like, okay, the truth is I've got this thing going on with my gallstones, and they're just dumping all of their stuff on you. Any guidance there for us?
Yeah, this definitely happens. And I would say oversharing and undersharing are both signs of an adjustment disorder because you're not using your discernment as to what's appropriate to share. That would be a sign to you that everything's not okay, but obviously, because they just unloaded all the reasons why it wasn't. At our core, humans want to be seen and heard or witnessed. So part of it is they simply want you to hear them. What this does not mean is that you need to come up with a 5-point plan as to how you can help them solve all the things they just unloaded on you. That is not your role. Your role is to listen, to validate. That sounds like a lot. I see why that may make it harder for you to really focus while you're here. Do you have any ideas about how we can make things better for you while you are at work? So, still keeping it tied to work, but validating that all of that absolutely impacts their ability to come to work and do the job. And honestly, the workplace might be the most stable place in their life.
Yeah. And I like how you said that phrase there, Andrea, because you connected those two things with an and, not a but. I hear this, I see that, that must be hard. I can understand that. And how can we make your time at work be the best it can be for you during this challenging time? Not, but I don't care and you need to just get through it. So I think that is an appropriate bridge that I heard was kind of implied. And you're so good at this, the rest of us would miss that nuance, but I wanted to call it out.
You're absolutely right because I think a lot of times the instinct is, do you need to leave? Do you need to take a day off? One day off is not going to solve that problem. So maybe they do need a flexible schedule or a day off that week to manage the immediate thing. But what can be done so they can still do the work that they really want to do? They don't want to be in this position. And I think a lot of times managers jump to the conclusion that they just want to flake or this is happening and they're 1 foot out. That's not necessarily true. It's just life is messy sometimes.
Absolutely. So that was the overshare. We also talked about if their performance is still sufficient. What if their performance is not necessarily sufficient? Like it's going below that threshold where you're like, okay, I have compassion for you. And I also am not getting sufficiently what we need over a long enough period of time. Now we got to do something. I know that's scary for some managers, especially because you're like, I don't want this to be seen as I'm doing this because of your situation. Give us a little guidance to navigate those muddy waters.
Very tough. And this was the position my sister found herself in. She was really trying. She was trying all the things she could do, and it still wasn't enough. Her work did, in my opinion, the appropriate thing, which was get really clear about what we expect and what we need from you, lay it out. You might call it a coaching plan, a performance plan, whatever language your workplace uses, but get really clear on the expectations and timelines and then say, how can we work with whatever you've got going on, whatever you need to still meet these deadlines and deliverables? And if you can't do that, then we need to talk about a transition or a different way to support you. Because at the end of the day, they still have to be able to show up and do the work with or without that accommodation. And so that's where we get into like the deeper conversations that you would absolutely want to pull in HR and go through that appropriate process.
Yeah. But again, it's not that you can't have the conversation. It's just how do you have the conversation? Just by seeing it gets you some connection and some trust, which is valuable, helps make all those other conversations a little more likely to be successful. But then you're still going back to here's the behavior, here's the results, here's the impact of that, and here's how they do or don't match the expectation. And then how can we solve this? And it's not necessarily up to me to come up with the solution, but it is okay for me to ask that we find one. That's all safe, that's all okay, and that should keep you out of court.
Yeah, and approaching it with compassion and care and truly trying to find the right solution, that's what's going to let you sleep well at night. One piece of coaching I give to managers in this situation, really in any performance plan, inside or outside of whatever scope it is, you do your very best to be clear, to be direct, to be kind, to help. And then that other person is an adult and they have to make a decision, and you are not responsible for the outcome. And you have to let that go. And now it's up to them to make a choice of what's best for them. And that's true here as well.
Great. Let's go to the other two herds you said. So we have the woolly mammoth, the adjustment. What's the second and third?
Okay, so the second would be the invisible elephants. This group is what we would traditionally think of when our brain automatically goes to a mental illness. So we're talking anxiety, depression, ADHD, obsessive compulsive disorder, PTSD, eating disorders, things like this. So this group spends a lot of energy trying to blend in and appear normal so that they're not seen as being different. Because remember, there's still a lot of stigma around these things. And so they spend a great deal of energy and time trying to blend in. You can create an environment that is consistent, flexible, gives people a heads up. Don't just pop a meeting on someone's calendar with no context or say, hey, drop in my office with no context. And so consistency is really important for anyone who falls into this group because then they know what to expect and they don't have to spend all that energy being on guard. You're not getting the full capacity of that person because they had to waste energy pretending and trying to just manage their day.
Andrea, what you just said there, I think will help some leaders overcome that limiting belief, which is I shouldn't have to do that. I shouldn't have to explain it. I shouldn't have to prepare it. I'm their boss. I want to meet with them. What's the big deal? So there's all these shoulds that go in that keep leaders from actually just taking the efforts to provide those little clues and those gateways so you're not creating those stressful or anxious conditions. But I think the payoff that you just said there was really the money part. And that is if as a leader you choose to provide that context or do those things to reduce that anxiety, the payoff for you and your organization is they now have more capacity to perform versus burning up that capacity unnecessarily with all of that worry. If you want to get the best out of this machine, you don't yell at it and say, hey, you should work on gasoline when it's a diesel engine. Well, if it needs diesel, give it diesel and then it will perform. I see that stops a lot of leaders from building those bridges and making those micro adaptations to allow a broader range of their employees to perform.
That's true. Some of us just need more time to process than others. Some people are great on the fly. A lot of people need a little time to get their thoughts together. Sometimes, as leaders, we want to wait till something is fully baked. We have the timeline, we have the project plan to roll it out or to even talk about it. And I think that's a miss most of the time because everybody know things change. Those people who are slow processors or who just need more time, they're going to go on that journey with you and be ready when you're ready. But if you don't tell them till the last minute, they're weeks away from being ready to go in their processing timelines. So you don't have to, but if you want the best outcome, then you need to find out how people receive information and how they process to get you what you want out of their output.
Absolutely. And everybody's got a different clock in terms of how they receive and process it. And to your point, if that takes you another month and now you have people that don't have that month to process, you've really undermined your own change efforts. We're talking about individual leader to teammates or colleagues conversation. When you're doing organizational change management at a broader scale, recognizing that you've got all of these types of herds out there and you got to make sure you're providing those gateways to ramp it up. That means you might need to provide the 30% view of it just to start that clock a little sooner. And obviously, caveating things will change, but of course it's going to change.
That's exactly right. And so if someone usually works this schedule, but you know it's going to change, let them know. If you have to cancel a meeting and you need to reschedule, let people know as soon as you can. Keep meetings as much as you can, because again, work might be the most consistent place that people have that really keeps them in a good place. And if that gets wobbly, it could throw off the rest of their structure.
Yeah. And in today's labor market, it'd be one thing to be like, well, hey, Andrea does it. She doesn't need any of this stuff. She just gets it done. And she's on her feet and she's smart and she's great and she's super adaptable. And you're like, okay, good luck finding you 10 Andreas. Sure, we all might have that person that's easier to lead. But if you're a great leader, it's not just about having the best players. How do you help all of your players perform at the highest level? Recognizing that, yeah, there's a point where you're like, that person isn't ready for this team. And I got to make that our choice too. But I think this is a good way to be able to get access to those invisible elephants. A little signaling, a little certainty goes a long way for this group.
It's such a good point because, again, I cannot reiterate enough. People who need accommodation or need a tweak or need more time are not trying to work the system. They're trying to find a way to do the job you hired them to do. People want to do a good job. And so that's another limiting mindset I've seen is managers think that this is some ruse. Why don't you just try it? And then 9 times out of 10, it gets better.
Usually the ones that are problem children are 10% of the ones you think are problem children. But then you get to that point where like, okay, if I try it and they're still doing this, now I've made that differential. So tell us about the third one. I'm really curious. You got me hanging on it. So you got the invisible camo ones, you've got the woolly ones. What are these third ones?
The last one are our rampaging pector. This group describes people who have an explosive or critical mental health event while at work. So here we're thinking of physical or emotional outburst. I hope no one experiences this. Usually there is some buildup, but it could just be someone got triggered on their worst day and they just have an outburst. If it's physical, then obviously follow your safety protocols, get everyone to a safe place, isolate the person, get them out, document everything. But in that situation, the piece that I see missed the most is the follow up. So sometimes we just want to brush it under the rug because it was awkward and maybe no one got hurt, but somebody threw something or something happened and we just don't want to talk about it. And that is a huge mistake. You don't know what that brought up for other people based on their life experience. You have no idea. So it is critical to follow up with every single person and just address it so that it can be out in the open and then move on. What I have seen more often, though, is the emotional outburst. There is the verbal or the emotional, like a meltdown, which nobody wants to be in this position. Like nobody wants to have a meltdown at work. That is a horrible day for someone. But I've also seen it show up in a rant on the chat or something inappropriate on the email, and people just lose perspective of who they're talking to and where they are. And it's just awkward. It's uncomfortable. It absolutely has to be addressed. But usually there is something deeper going on. And again, we are not their therapist. We are not trying to solve whatever it is, but we do have to address it. And usually that is a very direct conversation of final warning, a termination, just depending on the situation. But the piece we cannot forget is the follow up and care for those who witnessed it or were around.
I like how you're still trying to connect and empathize and support the rampaging pachyderm themselves, but because it's more kinetic, you also have to be mindful of its impact on everybody else around you on the team. Whereas the invisibles, they may or may not be having as obvious an impact on the other team members. So you have to focus more on them. And the woolly mammoths, their impact might be more secondary. They're like, I've been having to pick up more of the slack because Lee's not carrying his weight like he used to. And so maybe there's some bitterness that's going there, but it's more subtle and it builds versus it being an explosive burst, like you said. So is that kind of a way of characterizing the impact on the team dynamics?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to describe it. And again, usually the rampaging pachyderms are a very small group that hopefully you don't have to experience, but it does happen. So it's just important to call it out.
And like the other two that you described, none of us are immune to any of them. You put any of us in enough of a pressure cooker, you could have yourself a situation where, like, I just can't take it anymore. And you snap. And maybe it's not physical. Maybe you don't even raise your voice. So let me ask a permutation on this here, Andrew, because of your personal experience and also your professional expertise. A lot of the context we're talking about right now, the presumption is you're the supervisor. And you and I both subscribe to a philosophy of leadership that leadership is not tied to a position. You can lead up, in, out, sideways, all directions. So could we look at a scenario where you are a leader, but the person that may be exhibiting one of these three behaviors is maybe a level or two above you, or maybe they're a customer, maybe they're an external stakeholder that you're responsible for interacting with, and yet you're encountering this and it's impeding either your project or the service that you're trying to provide. Maybe it's stressing you out. You don't have that power to play off of. What else could you do?
I think to answer your question, it's actually very similar to a lot of the things we've already talked about. So, probably the biggest one is if you are having a one on one with your manager, be consistent, be prepared, lead there with here's what I'm solving, be proactive, serve up, make it easy, give them the bullet point, do everything you can to lower what they need to follow up from you directly. Be clear about what you can take on. Ask if there's anything else you can do if you have the capacity. And finally, don't take anything personally. And if you can show up, be proactive, solve as many of your own problems as possible, and ask if there's anything else you can do when you have the time and space, that is going to be the best way for you to help stabilize how that person is doing.
Yeah. And honestly, it's fair because earlier we said it's a cop out for a leader to say, I shouldn't have to do this for a team member. They should just accommodate me. By the same token, you shouldn't say, like, I shouldn't have to serve it up to my leader. They should just be able to take it however I send it to them. And I think both of those are really disrespectful. When you show respect, you're actually interested in how they like to receive things. That's the platinum rule, right? Not just treating others how you like to be treated, but treating them the way they like to be treated. And if you're a leader, you find out how to optimize the outcome. And if that means for Andrea, I make the adaptation to get the results that I want versus expecting the world to conform to me. What are your thoughts on that underlying mindset?
I could not agree with you more. I think if you want to grow in your career and level up and become a stronger leader, this is absolutely the mindset you're going to have. But you can't be expected to know all of that. So you appreciate it when they make it easy for you. And so that is equally true for your manager because your work is one piece of what they're doing. And so the easier and more tailored you can make it to each person is just going to make everything flow easier. It's going to improve your relationships. It's going to make you appear and be a great team player and a great leader as well.
Absolutely. And that's not to say that you need to suffer abuse in silence either. Now, if somebody is doing things that are truly crossing a line, either for you or legally or ethically or whatnot, as a manager of someone, you might have to help them make the decision that maybe this isn't the place for them. I think it's equally fair for an individual to say, you know what, honestly, yes, I can adapt to this leader, but I don't want to. Let's make accommodations or adjustments or adaptations to these normal varieties of mental challenging situations, that doesn't mean that you just have to deal with it to the terminal end either. You have options.
This only works if you have a healthy and functioning relationship that will get stress tested over time. And that is life, that is work. Everybody has more stressful times than others. But if someone is being just outrageous or rude, you got to handle that differently. But just in the normal ebb and flow of business, try and keep those things in mind. And what is the aggregated behavior over time? Was that a one off or is that now the norm? That's a good indicator as to how that person may be doing. And assuming that perhaps there could be something else going on outside of just our relationship with that person in a vacuum is probably a good assumption.
Yeah. I will challenge something you said a little bit earlier. You said, don't take it personally. I agree with that sentiment. And I found a little trick that I sometimes use to defuse the impact it has on me. And I do it by taking it really personally. So let's say that the person that's being really aggressive, the pachyderm you talked about, they're being aggressive with me because they feel safe being that way with me. There's enough trust and regard and belief that I could do it well, that they're being vulnerable and just letting it out on me. Where if it was somebody they thought less of, they wouldn't have done that to it. Or if somebody's evading me and being the invisible one, they care about what I think. And so that in of itself is a sign of regard and respect and love. They just don't know how to show it very well. So I walk out of this office, the boss just screamed at me and I'm like, wow, they really think so highly of me and they care so much about me. They're not worried about how it's packaged because they figure I can handle it. What a compliment. That's taking it very personally, right? And it's still a fabrication. It's still a story. It's still not really true. But just like it's really not true, like they woke up that morning to try to intentionally hurt your feelings. That's not true either. So if you're going to lie to make yourself feel better.
That is how children are. Children normally act out to their parents because it is safe to do so. There is some psychology to back that up. And if it makes you feel better to get through the day and think about it that way, then go for it.
Andrea, this has been incredibly insightful and stimulating. Thank you so much for sharing some of your insights and your personal stories with being able to recognize how a leader can identify different levels of mental well-being in the office and some strategies for adapting to it. Andrea, how can people find out more about you, where they can get your book? Where can they hear about your podcast?
Probably the easiest way is you can follow me on LinkedIn, Andrea Herron, Herron, or sidesconsultingservices.com is where you'll find all the books and information about speakerships and things like that.
Fantastic. So definitely take advantage of this great thought leader. Very much appreciate the generosity of your time today, Andrea. Have a great weekend ahead of yourself as well, and keep taking care of those elephants.
Thank you. It was lovely to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us today on the Unleashing Leaders podcast. Subscribe so you don't miss a moment that could be the key to your next breakthrough. Let's stay connected and contribute together by grabbing that @Unleashing Leaders handle on LinkedIn, YouTube, or your favorite network. This is Lee Scott. Keep learning, loving, and leading. Our future and our communities are counting on us.